Daniel chapter 11, and we're picking up in verse 41. It says, he shall enter also into the glorious land. Many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. So the glorious land is Israel. This man has power over many countries, but it seems as though Transjordan escapes. Transjordan is comprised of three countries: Edom, Moab, and Ammon. In fact, I was in Jordan not too long ago. Much different spirit in Jordan than Egypt. Much different. You could feel the difference. I mean, major difference. But it says, these shall escape. Verse 44, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Then I would take it to mean that the glorious holy mountain would be Mount Zion. But as we have mentioned a few times, I think there's going to be a few nations that oppose him, even though they are deprived from being a part of mutual trade or whatever. But I hope that we are one of them. So, in summary of chapter 11, we see a man that foreshadows the Antichrist to come. However, we have to realize that Antiochus IV was only a figure. The Antichrist is a man from the past. He's an undefeated, never defeated. You can't say that about Antiochus. And also, the Antichrist has an image from the past that's recognizable. You can't say that about Antiochus. So the whole world wonders after the beast that was. And we mentioned that a little bit earlier, so I won't repeat that again. Let's move on to chapter 12. Now, chapter 12 not only brings closure to the book, but it brings us to the end of the church age, to the end of the millennium, and into eternity. Chapter 12 begins by bringing us right into the Great Tribulation in verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up. This is the angel. The great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Again, much to consider from verse 1 here. We see a time of trouble coming such as there never has been since the beginning of time. And it's a time of Jacob's trouble, or the Great Tribulation. And of course, Jesus picks up on that as well in his Olivet Discourse. And it begins with the abomination of desolation. And Jesus is speaking of something future here in Matthew 24. And he talks about the abomination, and then in verse 21, he says, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days shall be shortened, there shall no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So, still in verse 1, we see that Michael, the archangel, stands up for God's people. He's the angelic prince over Israel. He's the good prince. And it appears as though if there had not been a divine intervention here, these people would have been totally destroyed as a nation. And even though Jerusalem is like the epicenter of, the tribulation, it's like the center of it, still the whole world is affected by what takes place. And when Jesus talks about the elect, he's talking about the redeemed. I mean, many Christians believe that they're going to be taken out at the beginning of the 7-year period, but the abomination doesn't even take place until the middle of the last 7 years. And Jesus said, when you see this, the church has to be there to see it. He talks about the Antichrist sitting in the temple. Paul said, don't be deceived on this point. The gathering unto him is not going to be until you see this man sitting in the temple declaring himself to be God. So, at the very best, the church has to go through at least the first 3.5 years, but we believe it's going to be longer than that. But we do see a time of trouble coming on natural Israel, and what happens there reflects on the church as well. But still in verse 1, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And definitely speaks of the salvation of Israel. And I also believe it has inference to the rapture of the church. The rapture of the church takes place shortly before Israel's redemption, right before the end. And we'll consider that before we end here as well. Going on to verse 2, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, you almost could read two advents into this verse, because there is a resurrection at the time of the second coming, but not everybody is resurrected at that time. And Revelation chapter 20 makes that very clear. Great resurrection is at the very end of the millennium. Everybody is resurrected at that time, the good and the bad. The bad are not resurrected at the second coming. They're resurrected at the great white throne, which is at the end of the millennium. Are we all clear on that? Okay. It's at the very end of the millennium, the great white throne. So you could almost read two advents into this. The resurrection at the time of Christ is called the first resurrection. That's the one that Paul was shooting for. He wanted to be a part of the first resurrection. And at the end of the millennium, then everybody gets resurrected. But anyway, people have to qualify to be a part of the first resurrection. Some of the saints will not be resurrected until the end. And as I said, Revelation 20 details both of these resurrections. Going on to verse 3, and they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. The wise inherit glory. The wise son keeps the commandments. The wise son lives with eternity in view and the fear of the Lord. He that is wise wins souls. You could almost do a little seminar on the wise inherit glory. Now, Paul compares the resurrection to the celestial bodies in heaven. And there are many distinctions in the celestial bodies in heaven. There's a glory of the sun and the moon and the stars. Some are very distant, some are very bright. And so it's going to be in the resurrection. Not everybody's the same. And In fact, some stars are invisible, um, but some are very distinct, some are very bright, and the wise are going to shine as the brightness. But in 1 Corinthians 15:40, Paul is talking about the resurrection here, and he compares it to the celestial bodies in heaven. And so, reading from 1 Corinthians 15:40, there are also celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial. But the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For one star differeth from another star in glory, so also is the resurrection of the dead. Big distinction in the resurrection. Some people have paid a price, they shine brightly, they've invested their life. Other people, they make it, they're saved by fire, and they have nothing waiting for them in eternity. We want to be those who shine brightly in eternity. Amen? Many distinctions. There are those who are called least in the kingdom. There are those who are called great. There are those who have crowns. There are those who do not have crowns. There are some who have rewards. There are some who do not have rewards. Very scriptural, right? Okay, going on to verse 4. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Many shall run to and fro. And I'll tell you what, we certainly live in that generation, don't we? We can be in Bombay in the morning and New York City in the evening. I mean, today we can travel in a few hours what it used to take weeks and months to travel. And the commerce today is, it's global. You're here, you're there. We travel around the world. I mean, back in the 1800s, who would have ever thought they could, fly to China and stand on the Great Wall and come back the next day or something, And then knowledge shall be increased, and it means that it's going to be greatly, actually, that the way that that's worded is greatly increased. And there's probably been more invention, scientific breakthroughs in the last 100 years than there has been since the beginning of time. And you could even break it down farther and say there has been more invention in the last 50 years than there has been since the beginning of time. In fact, today you can get something that's innovative and it's the new thing, and a year from now it's outdated and there's something better out there. But it's God who gives knowledge. And God has allowed man to probe into the hidden world, into the atom, and into bacteria and things that through the microscope. But all of this reflects on the spiritual realm. First the natural, and then the spiritual. And as God has allowed man to probe into the hidden things in the natural world, it's going to be the same in the spirit. I believe that the last day, God is going to open up the minds of his people to see things that have been hidden from the beginning of time. Do you believe that? I really do. I believe God's going to open up his word and the mysteries that have been hidden from the beginning. Even the revelation of this book. Seal this book until the time of the end. This book has been sealed from people, but it's our generation that has to have it opened up. It's been sealed to the time of the end. And we're in the final generation, according to all the types. There's 2,000 years given to the church age. If the church fulfills exactly 2,000 years, the church age began in 30 AD, and this is 18. What do we have? 12 years? 12 years to go to make 2,000? So time is running out. 6,000 years given to man, then 1,000 years Sabbath. 2,000 years given to the church age. So we're running out of time here, aren't we? Things have to materialize real quick. Now, in verse 5 and 6, Daniel listens to a conversation in heaven as to how long this time of trouble is going to be. And in verse 6, and one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. Which is how long? 3.5 years. Remember, time speaks of a year, time, times, and half a time. That's 3.5 years. The Great Tribulation period is 3.5 years, or 42 months, and that falls into that same range. So we've considered that phrase a number of times. It's in Revelation as well.
Do they always go by the calendar year like we do now? Did they keep a 360 days?
Well, I think they went by a solar calendar, and then they added a month every so often. They added a 13th month. But any which way you cut it, it's even put into days later on. It's like, in fact, there's 3 dates that we really have to reconcile. We'll look at that before we close, but there's 3 dates, 3 stages of the Lord's coming. One of them is 1260, one of them is 1290, and the next one is 1335. There's 3 dates that we have to look at. There's actually 3 stages of the Lord's coming. There's like a 30-day gap in the one, and then a 45-day gap in the next. Well, we'll look at them later, but it's 1260, 1290, and then 1335. 1335. Daniel mentions 2 of these time periods in this chapter here. But just remember here, Daniel 8 and 9, I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Again, it's a book that will be opened, and hopefully is opening now, because we're getting close to the end. Now, Daniel is an end-time book. It is part of the eschatological puzzle. Daniel gives us keys to this end-time puzzle. So we have to understand the book of Daniel because it's part of the puzzle. In verse 10, many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. 1290. So take note of that. From the time that the daily sacrifice is set up, taken away, and the image set up, is going to be 1,290 days. And so this abomination, which we know from other verses, takes place right in the middle of the last 7-year period of time. But we still have 3 dates that we have to reconcile. The next time period that's mentioned here in verse 12, it goes on in verse 12. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. So now we're looking at 1335, which is another 45-day extension. And there's also one more date that we have to put into the mix here. And that date is found in Revelation chapter 12. And this is where the woman is protected for 1260 days. Now, the woman, when the Great Tribulation starts, in the middle of the last 7 years, the woman is protected for 1260. And I'm quoting now from Revelation 12:6. And the woman fled into the wilderness where she hath a place prepared of God. Remember, this is metaphor. That they should feed her there 1,260 days, 1260. So when the tribulation period begins, the woman is protected for 1260. And then and there's a 30-day gap here to the next date. And then 1290 days, at 1290, the abomination is removed. Remember, it's going to be set up for 1,290 days. And then there's another 45-day gap, 1335, and that takes us to the Mount of Olives. So there's actually 3 stages here to the Lord's coming, and we're going to consider these now. 3 dates. So the first date that we're going to look at is the 1260. The abomination is set up. And the woman is protected. This is the church for 1260. So she's somewhat protected. I know there's going to be martyrdom that takes place, but she is protected for 1260 days. And so I would dare to say that the reason only 1260 is because I would say that's when the rapture takes place, at the end of the 1260. So the church goes up. Then there's a 30-day gap. Remember that the beast and the Antichrist are still here when the church goes up. So the woman is taken up, and it seems as though that the marriage supper would be a 30-day affair. There's 30 days, and the way I picture the marriage supper is that it's not just a celebration, or not just a banquet, but it's orientation. Because the ones who are counted worthy to be a part of the bride, overcomers, they're coming back down in the next scene, which is Armageddon. The Lord is returning with his armies from heaven. They're coming back down. This is when the Antichrist is destroyed. And so I would say that during this marriage feast, it's kind of orientation. The part that you're going to play in his government upon earth when he comes down. You understand that? Have I lost you yet? So after 1260, the woman is protected, and I'm making a little guess here, that the church would go up after the 1260. The marriage supper would be a 30-day affair, and then the Lord returns Armageddon, and the armies in heaven come, and that's when the Antichrist is destroyed. That's when the abomination is removed. 1290, 30 days later, when the Lord comes back, Armageddon in Revelation 19, the Antichrist is destroyed, and I would say that that's when his image is removed from the temple and the temple cleansed. Now, here's the good one. There's still a 45-day extension. I asked Pastor Bailey about this because I'm thinking to myself, why is there another 45-day extension? Blessed is he that waiteth for another 45 days after that. I said, where's the church? He said, oh, they're on earth. But, there's still a siege of Jerusalem, and the Arab armies from the east, they come, and when the Lord finally stands on the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem is besieged, and half of the city is fallen, right at the time that he returns on the Mount of Olives in Zechariah. And I said, well, how can that be? I mean, after they saw what happened in Armageddon, which is about 100 miles north. In fact, I've seen the Valley of Megiddo. A few months ago I was there. I was looking at this plain, this Valley of Megiddo, which is 100 miles north. The siege of Jerusalem is different. And I said to Pastor Bailey, how could anybody be so stupid as to come against Jerusalem, after Armageddon? Well, these are armies from the north that are coming down at Armageddon. The siege of Jerusalem are armies from the east. They're Arab armies. And the Lord comes from the east, destroys them, and in that last scene there, and he stands on the Mount of Olives, and then Israel says, we've waited for you. But half of the city is fallen. But, it was still kind of a puzzle to me. I said, Lord, Pastor Bailey, how could that be? After seeing a wipeout of an army up north, why would armies from the east come in and besiege the city? And he said, well, the Antichrist and the false prophet are destroyed at Armageddon, but he said Satan is still here until the Mount of Olives, and that's when he's just cast into hell. If you think about this, at the end of the millennium, Satan is released from hell for one more mission. He's going to deceive some of the nations, the goat nations, that haven't really, received the message of Christ even during the millennium, because there's still carnality here during the millennium, even though Satan is bound. And he comes up and he deceives certain nations to come against Jerusalem. This is when the Lord himself is actually reigning in Jerusalem. At the end of 1,000 years, they come against him. Now, if Satan deceives the whole world and all of these wicked nations to come against the Lord Jesus Christ as he's reigning in Jerusalem, then he could easily deceive these Arab armies to come against Jerusalem, during this 45-day delay or extension, however you want to look at it. Do you see what I'm saying? Or no? Everybody's so silent. I don't know whether I'm getting through or not. It is. It is. It is. This book is not, we crammed this into 8 sessions here. I'm just about to the end here, but I had to cram this into 8 classes. And you could spend a lot of time You know, I've had a hard time with this teaching. I mean, it feels like I have a mouthful of marbles and I can hardly get it out. And I was thinking last night, I mean, it was very difficult to speak last night. And, you know, I'm thinking, Lord, am I really missing it here? Yesterday, we began in chapter 8 of Daniel. And we began by looking at the ram with two horns, one higher than the other, Media Persia. This morning, I turned on the television. And here is a teacher on television. And what's he teaching? He's teaching Daniel chapter 8 about the horn, the ram with the two horns, one higher than the other. And I thought to myself, my God, you know, the chances of me turning on the television, hear somebody preaching the same thing that I started with last night is phenomenal. You know, it really is a message that God wants. We're in time, we're in tune with the Spirit, but there's still, you know, opposition. It's a message that I'm sure that the enemy doesn't like to hear because it tells all about his demise and his end. The beast and the false prophet, they have their demise at the end of the Great Tribulation. But Satan, he's bound after the Mount of Olives, and he's in hell for 1,000 years until the very end, and then he has one more ministry to fulfill. But I think we're just about to the end here of our study. It looks like I'm actually early. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. And you know, when the Lord finally comes on the Mount of Olives, as you see it in Zechariah and in Isaiah as well, they're saying, we have waited for you. And, you know, they recognize him and they say, what are these wounds in your hands? And he says, well, these are the wounds I received in the house of my friends. And they look upon him whom they pierced. And this is at the end of the millennium. At the end of the tribulation when the Lord returns and he stands on the Mount of Olives. And they realize that they rejected their Messiah. And at that point, their iniquity is pardoned. They paid double for their sins, and they entered the new covenant. And so for Israel, it's a new day. However, even in the millennium, there's still certain judgments. The church actually has a higher place in eternity than natural Israel. And during the millennium, you find in Ezekiel's temple that the Jews still have to sacrifice animals. The church doesn't. The Jews do. And the reason for that is because they had rejected their sacrifice of Christ. And so they offer sacrifice throughout the millennium. Let me just read here from Zechariah 14. And this is the last stage. This is the blessed is he that waiteth to the 1335. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Actually, the Zion half of the city remains. Zion is still standing. In verse 3, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And that's referring to Armageddon. He's going to fight against them as he did Armageddon. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east. and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. This final act here begins the millennium. When the Lord stands on Mount Zion, that begins the millennium. Satan is cast into hell at that time. And as I said, he is there for the 1,000-year. Satan and demons and all evil spirits are in hell during the millennium. But at the very end, Satan is released because there is still sin during the millennium, even when Satan is not here. You know, people like to blame Satan for their, say, well, the devil made me do it. But when? The millennium? Oh, but you know what? During the millennium, the Jews are his ministers. There's preaching in the millennium. There's still churches in the millennium. People still, you know, cities are still here. People still go to church. In fact, you know, I've often thought about this, you know, that during the millennium, it would be nice to invite certain people from the past, like maybe Martin Luther or John Huss or John Wycliffe, to come and speak some Sunday at our church or something like that. But
Is that when I'm thinking about the time if certain people don't come up to the feast, that they'll look upon.
absolutely, that's in Malachi. Well, actually, it's in Zechariah too. It's right in that same chapter, I think. During the millennium, there's still rebellion, even though Satan is bound. They all have to submit to the rule of Christ. He rules the nations with a rod of iron, and so whether they like it or not, they're going to have to submit. Yeah, actually, that's true too. I mean, there's a place on earth where they can look down into hell. But in Zechariah, where's Zechariah? Sorry. You know, and beginning in verse 16, it says, "It shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem, even shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." This is the dominant feast during the millennium, Feast of Tabernacles. "And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain." So if nations don't cooperate, then there's famine in their land. And verse 18, "And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, that have no rain, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord shall smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." So they have to submit to the rule of Christ during the millennium, or there's no rain. There's plagues that come upon their land or whatever. And these same nations are the ones that are deceived at the end, by Satan to come against Jerusalem. And then the Lord destroys them. Then there's the great white throne judgment where everybody is resurrected at that time. But there's sin in the millennium. There's mortals in the millennium. There's preaching in the millennium.
Where does it say about that? Looking into hell?
It's in Isaiah, I think 66. They shall 66 or 65, I think. Yeah. It's Isaiah. Well, yeah, there's a place that's actually opened. It's right at the very end of the 66. It says, well, we could start at verse 22. It says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh." So they can actually look into hell. Yeah, I know. It's amazing how people can have visions of hell and they can be warned, and still their hearts are so hardened that they still rebel. Any other questions here on any of this?
Well, after the rapture, then does the church come back? You said, well, we have churches here and stuff for the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an in-between time?
Well, the church, let's just say the church goes up. It's a 30-day event in heaven, and they come back at the Armageddon. And the armies in the north are destroyed in the plain of Megiddo, but then there's a final siege, and at that siege the Lord stands on the Mount of Olives, and then the millennium begins. But during the 1,000-year reign on earth, people still are conducting their business. There is still sin during the millennium. People live long lives. It goes back to the way it was before the flood. It says that the sinner being 100 years old shall die, being accursed. And in other words, oh, he's just a kid. He's only 100 years old, and he died. So there's longevity restored. People live long lives in the millennium.
What does that mean for the overcomers that are there during the millennium?
Oh, these are people.
Will they live that long? Will they be there?
Well, overcomers are immortal.
I mean, will they be there?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They're going to be his government on earth.
So they'll be there for the whole millennium.
Those who have either been raptured or have a part of the first resurrection will be on earth.
Yeah.
The rest of the dead don't live until the end of the 1,000 years. They'll be saints in heaven that don't qualify to reign on earth during the millennium. Not everybody's going to reign on earth during the millennium.
First resurrection when Moses and Elijah.
What's that?
Is the first resurrection when Moses and Elijah?
No. The first resurrection is at the second coming. That's the first resurrection. I don't want to get into the first fruits right now. That's first fruits, and I don't want to. That's not the first resurrection. Okay. No, it's not the first resurrection. No. First resurrection. Number one, you have to be dead to be resurrected. So it's throughout the church age and some of the ancients, even from the Old Testament, that are counted worthy to be a part of the millennium, they will be resurrected at the second coming, and those who are alive and are counted worthy will be taken up there too. So
they'll be coming back.
The saints will come back and fight with him. Go down the road again.
yeah, his army's in heaven.
I mean, first fruits and...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, come right back. Yeah. Oh, what were you going to say, Debbie?
Well, this is what I think to do with that. This is more of
Okay.
Where it says in 12:2, it says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Because you always tell us that when a saint dies, we don't just like go and sleep in the grave.
Mm-hmm.
With God. So
Yeah.
what's it?
Well,
That always confused me.
yeah, that's
when I
just
read that.
it's just metaphor of death. You know, it's just metaphor because when the saints die, their spirits are in heaven. Their bodies, of course, decay in the earth, but yeah.
So that means maybe that's what means that they're reunited with their body. Is that
Absolutely. This is what the resurrection is about. The spirits of just men, when a person dies now, their spirit leaves their body, if they're going to heaven, that is. And well, they're going one of two places. They're going up or down. So if they go to heaven, they're there in their spirit. And the resurrection, they're rejoined with their body, but this body is going to rematerialize from whatever shape it's in. It could be burned, it could be scattered in 1,000 different places, but it's all coming together, and they shall stand resurrected. That's the good and the bad. So in the great resurrection, everybody, the good and the bad, are resurrected, and they stand before God in a never-dying body, and they spend eternity in a body that doesn't die.
You need to make us a diagram. Yeah. A timeline.
Well, like I said, this is only an eight class course here, and it's pretty tough to jam a course like this into 8 classes. But I hope you all have a little bit better picture of things at this point. And if you have any questions, even in the future, you can bring them up and try to answer them for you. Okay? This is the difference between preaching and teaching. A preacher can proclaim things, and a teacher has to explain things. A preacher can just say a lot of unsubstantiated things, and you wonder where he's coming from. But a teacher has to explain. The preacher proclaims, the teacher explains. What the world needs today is teachers. Okay, thus ends the book of Daniel. Thank you very much for coming. God bless you very much.